Support for this episode of Judaism Unbound comes from the All-Inclusive podcast with Jay Ruderman.
Hi, I'm Jay Ruderman. All-Inclusive is a podcast focused on inclusion and social justice. Join me as I interview leaders and experts on the latest news focused on advocacy for social justice. In order to make progress that will lead to a more equitable future, honest discussions must be held. That is what All-Inclusive is all about. Listen and subscribe to the All-Inclusive podcast on Apple, Stitcher, Spotify, and anywhere else podcasts are available. Visit the show website for more information and full episode transcripts at www.allinclusivepodcast.com.
This is Judaism Unbound, episode 284, Jews in Pews Studies. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Liebenson.
And I'm Lex Rofberg.
And today we are going to start an examination that will continue also next week about the recent Jewish demographic study conducted by the Pew Research Center. This study is called Jewish Americans in 2020, although it did come out in 2021. And it's the second study of Jewish Americans conducted by the Pew Research Center. The first one came out in 2013, and it was called A Portrait of Jewish Americans. That 2013 study got a lot of press, particularly for this finding that a substantial number of Jews, 22% at the time, were what they called Jews of no religion. Those were people who, when given a list of religions to check off which one they were, they checked off none of the above, or atheists or something like that. And then it was determined later in the study that they considered themselves, or that the Pew Research Center's criteria somehow identified them as Jewish, and that was what they called Jews of no religion. There were a variety of other findings in that 2013 study that were significant and important, that generated a lot of conversation in the Jewish community, but apparently much less action in the Jewish world in terms of new initiatives funded on the basis of that 2013 Pew study than, for example, the 1990 Jewish population study, which famously led to a number of large initiatives, including the Foundation for Jewish Camps establishment and the establishment of Birthright. But almost 25 years later, the 2013 study came out and had some interesting and dramatic findings, but it seems like not all that much really came out of that. And now here we are 7 or 8 years later with the next study that seems to be getting a lot less press attention, perhaps in part because it's more or less in line with the previous study. But in the meantime, we are very excited to welcome our guest today, Tema Smith, from an organization called 18 Doors. Tema Smith recently published an article on the 18 Doors website, and we'll link to that in our show notes, called The Missing 2020 Pew Study Headlines, a reframing of the headlines about the Pew study of Jewish Americans in 2020, which tells a different story with specific focus on interfaith couples. The mission of 18 Doors is to empower people in interfaith relationships, individuals, couples, families, and their children, to engage in Jewish life and make Jewish choices, and it encourages Jewish communities to welcome them. Before rebranding as 18 Doors, this organization was known as interfaithfamily.com, so you might know them under that previous name. Tema Smith is the Director of Professional Development at 18 Doors. In that role, she works in partnership with Jewish professionals, educators, and clergy to help them develop the skills and tools they need to fully embrace interfaith couples and families. Before joining 18 Doors, she was a synagogue professional and also completed a certificate in interfaith families Jewish engagement at Hebrew College. By the way, Lex also completed that program. We are really excited to start this conversation about the meaning of the 2020 Pew study of Jewish Americans, and we are especially excited to begin this conversation with Tema Smith. So, Tema Smith, welcome to Judaism Unbound. It's so great to have you.
Thank you. Long-time listener, first-time caller.
We love those. Those are our favorite. So, and I would say, same to you, and especially recently, because to some extent, the genesis of Judaism Unbound, in a bit of a roundabout way, is the previous Pew study that came out in 2013. It took us a few years to get our act together and start the podcast, but it was kind of jumping off that understanding of the Jewish community as looking different from the way a lot of people thought it did, and facing that in an optimistic way. And a lot of people were fretting about it, and we were whatever the opposite of fretting is. We were ready to embrace this and figure out what it all means. And so we wanted to have you on starting to talk based on the 2020 Pew study, because you wrote this great piece, or put together this great piece, to think about how the data of the Pew study could be presented in a way that would give it a different reception, let's say, within the Jewish community. So could we start with you just describing a little bit about some of the examples of what you put out there, and also like what motivated you to do this?
Yeah, sure. So one of the things that really stuck with me after the last Pew study was how the data was presented, where there was actually what it was showing was actually an increase in, for example, Jewish identification for children of interfaith families and things like that. But the data was being presented as a doomsday scenario that, children of interfaith families are less likely to be Jewish. And so when this time around the study came out, that was the first chart I looked for. And guess what? It said the same thing. The chart heading said, intermarried parents much less likely to be raising their children Jewish. And I looked at it, and actually it looked to me like the numbers had gone up from the previous time. And yet we were still telling the doomsday narrative. And it was very clear to me there that the majority of Jews who have married somebody of a different background are raising their children Jewish. This is a very different picture than comparing to a Jewish couple and sort of using that to say this is actually bad for our community, which is essentially what that implies. And once I started there, I was like, what other data is, you only get one chance to put a heading on a chart. So what other headings could go on charts for the same data, whether it is something that is actually painting a positive picture where a negative picture has been painted, like in that instance, or pulling out a different and really salient data point. And so I started flipping through, and my personal interest is in sort of diversity of Jewish communities, so interfaith families, racial and ethnic diversity, but also in areas like, why do people choose not to go to synagogue and things like that? I worked in synagogues for 8 years, so I kept finding more and more and more data points that could actually be read in ways that suggested different courses of action. So as an example, looking at data around officiation of interfaith weddings, that was actually quite a positive picture already on the chart. About 2/3 of Jews say rabbis should perform interfaith marriage ceremonies. Orthodox disagree. But we actually could tell this story in a handful of other ways that are indicative of sort of bigger changes, like 67% of Jews aged 65 and up believe that rabbis should officiate at interfaith weddings. Tells a very interesting story. And that's not a point that you would necessarily pull out based on that headline. So that was really where I started. And then I just kind of kept going down this rabbit hole. I'm still going down that rabbit hole. I haven't really written it because I'll be honest, I haven't finished the 300 pages of the Pew study just yet.
How dare you not read 300-page studies? Ugh.
But yeah, I think it's just, I am somebody who loves to read against the grain wherever I can. And this felt like a very natural place to do that.
I've been thinking about, what if there would be a study about Jewish delis, and it would have like headlines like children of vegetarians not coming to the deli, and of course they wouldn't come to the deli because they're vegetarians and the deli serves meat, but the deli could serve other types of food, but they don't. But so on the one hand, you could read this as gloom and doom because the current menu is obviously not going to appeal to people who are different from the current customers. And sometimes that feels to me like what these Jewish demographic studies are fundamentally all about. What they're really saying is that people aren't buying the Judaism that we've been selling, which is a very different thing to say than people are not interested in Judaism. So I'm wondering if that's, have you come up with a better metaphor? Is there some other way that it's guiding you through these analyses?
That's a good question. I don't think I've necessarily landed on a metaphor, but I think what you are gesturing at in that one is bang on. And one of the ones that really stuck with me of these charts is most common reason offered by those who rarely or never attend religious services is I'm not religious. Shocker. However, what was really interesting to me, right, that was 67% say I'm not religious. But what was really interesting is that 55% of Jews who say they don't go to synagogue say that they express their Jewishness in other ways. Okay, so maybe synagogue service isn't right for you. I know all sorts of people who don't connect to Judaism through going to Shabbat services. What are those other ways that people are expressing their Judaism? That is where the program opportunity is. That's where the engagement opportunity is. Yet the way that it's presented, again, is doom and gloom. We have a community that is not religious, that isn't going to synagogue. And like, what are we going to do with that? How are we going to make people more religious and go to synagogue instead of how are we going to tap into those other ways people are expressing their Judaism?
I really appreciate this from both of you. I mean, maybe my metaphor, I feel like the approach so many people take to these studies is almost like they're getting a checkup at the doctor, only it's not them getting the checkup. It's like the Jewish people as a whole getting a checkup. And the whole point of these studies is like, are we dying or not? Like that's sort of, and by the way, that's when you're a person and you get a checkup, like that's an important thing to get checked. Like I'm not saying that's an irrelevant question, but that's not the only thing the doctor is interested in, because it turns out if you're a functioning human that isn't in the immediate sense dying, there's a lot of other things to think about in your life. Are you doing X? Are you doing Y? How's your mental health? How's your, like, we could go all sorts of directions, but I feel like we look at these studies and we're so stuck in like, oh my gosh, is the number of Jews going up, going down? By the way, spoiler alert, number appears to be going up. That's right. One of the big lead points of 2020 and a little more arguably 2013, but like certainly 2020, the numbers of Jews have gone up since the 2013 one. And there haven't been that many conversations I've seen about Pew, interestingly. Maybe we can talk more about that. But like what I have seen hasn't started from a place of, oh, wow, the Jewish community is growing. Given that that's the case, what does that mean? At the very best, I think some places are like, oh, maybe the Jewish community isn't shrinking. That's kind of good. But option A is to see it as a checkup. Option B is to be like, wow, we actually have a chance to look at a bunch of nitty gritty things about how Jews are doing their Jewishes. Mm-hmm. By the way, all this, we're going to have this in our show notes. So if you're confused by these numbers that are throwing out, like go to our website. We have Tema's article. We have the Pew study so that you can like look at some of this stuff as you're hearing it. But like I did some number crunching. And if you take the group of people that are Jews, not by religion, so people who say they're Jewish, but if you ask them what religion they are, they say something, they don't say that it's Jewish. And then you add to that all those people you just described, Tema, who said they're not religious. It turns out that over half of the Jewish respondents to this survey indicate in some question on the survey that they're not religious. So what do we do with that? Or what do you do with that, Tema, as somebody who does work daily to engage people, whether it's religiously or otherwise, in Judaism?
I will argue this till I'm blue in the face. I think people see it as a hierarchy, that Jews by religion are more Jewish than Jews not by religion. And I think that's absolutely false. First of all, religion separated out from Jewish identity in that way is based on a Christian understanding of religion. For Jews, where Judaism is a peoplehood, a nationality, an ethnicity, and a religious expression, and an intellectual tradition, and, you know, I also think of it in terms of the distinction. You know, you hear Jews so often be like, oh, I'm a bad Jew, right? Like, are you religious if you don't keep kosher? And so people, I think for a lot of liberal Jews, they associate like the idea of being a religious Jew with orthodoxy, which is, again, complicated. And so we kind of have a little bit, I am almost inclined to say, throw out that distinction, because some of what's really interesting here is the granularity of, you know, I'm a Jew by no religion, but I fast on Yom Kippur every year and have 2 Passover Seders and go to synagogue for the high holidays and then we'll turn around and say, and I'm not Jewish by religion. Like, that's kind of nonsensical when you really get into sort of that level of looking at it. So, for example, interfaith families, by and large, the Jewish individual in that couple does not consider themselves to be Jewish by religion. So the language that we might want to use in engaging them in Jewish life is probably not going to be the language that is associated with religion per se. And, I talk about it a lot, that there's sort of a bias that we bring to it when we read it, when we see that hierarchy, and we're seeing it over and over and over throughout this whole study. And I even feel it. And ironically, I think by the categories, I probably am a Jew of no religion, despite the fact that I was a synagogue membership director for 8 years. I, chant Haftarah, I work in the community, but I don't think of myself as religious. And so, these are the moments where I'm like, this breaks down. This just falls apart. I see a lot of the stuff in the Pew study as instructive to us on how people are connecting, how people are plugging in, rather than who's plugging in more or less. One of the data points that was really interesting to me is the number of Jewish people in interfaith families who share Jewish food and holidays with friends and presumably family who are not Jewish. And, this is something that's telling us that Jewish food and holidays is important to people. Interestingly, sometimes you look and the same people will say that Jewish food and holidays are not necessarily that important to them, yet they're sharing it. So, there's so many reasons that people might answer different questions in this study differently. And so just reading between the lines every time, I think, is really crucial. Yeah.
It reminds me, I forget if it was on our show or if I just heard Jay Michelson say this somewhere else. He talked about how there was like a survey issued at one point about anti-Semitism, and based on the questions it actually, he was criticizing the survey. He was saying like it would have made him an anti-Semite based on his answers, which, shows that how we ask questions matters a lot. But I think that this piece is so important. And it's not that I'm here to say like reject everything in this study because the questions were perfect, but I do think we should ask questions about the questions. And I kind of wanted to open up a piece now, before we get too deep into the episode, just so we can weave it all together, that you didn't focus on as much in that particular 7 principle article, but that I know you do a lot of work on, which is the racial and ethnic diversity piece. There's all sorts of data in the Pew study and other places related to racial and ethnic diversity in Jewish life, related to Jews of color. And there's debates about how those conversations are even had and how we categorize people, all of that. And so I'd love to open that piece up, not to distract from the pieces so far, but just so that we can do some weaving together of it all as this conversation continues.
That's bang on. I think, first of all, I just want to point out that this is by far not the first national study of the Jewish population of the United States. But this is really the first time that any of these studies has asked a clear question about the racial and ethnic diversity of the Jewish community. The Jews of Color Initiative had made an effort to sort of combine a bunch of different study methodologies to try and extrapolate how many Jews of color are there, and pieces like that. So this is actually really encouraging. And it's simultaneously depressing that it took us till like 2019, 2020 to actually get this question into a survey in a way that actually garners useful data, and encouraging that actually the voices of people saying like, hey, like, we're here and we count, have finally been heard on sort of a national level in this way. What is really interesting about it, and probably no surprise, is that it shows that younger Jews are more racially and ethnically diverse, and interfaith families are more likely to have somebody who is of a non-white racial background in their home. I live in Canada. We talk about race a little bit different here, where we differentiate between race and ethnicity very, very clearly. And I always laugh that like American census data is like the only ethnicity that exists is you're like Hispanic or you're not Hispanic. Whereas in Canada, you actually get like blank boxes on the census to like write in your ethnicity, and you can write in multiple ethnicities, and it prompts you. It's like where your ancestors came from, and it gives you like a list of suggestions, and Jewish is one of them. The last census, so the way that they used to do it was it would list the highest 20 ethnicities from the previous census to like cue people that these are the options. And Jewish dropped off the top 20 with demographic changes, immigration, and things like that. And what ended up happening was it looked like the Jewish population in Canada dropped by like 50% from the previous census, because without being prompted to write Jewish, Jews didn't write Jewish. And so we ended up with like actually a really big kind of kerfuffle trying to figure out, because obviously people use census data to figure out how to fund the community. And we ended up with like a crisis. And I think it was back on the list this time. I don't really understand how that happened, but it was really interesting. And I just think of this though, like it's very funny being sort of on both sides of the border all the time, the different ways in which people sort of express this anxiety about how many Jews there are and how Jews express their identity. One of the things that I thought was really fascinating here is that Pew actually ran the numbers in different ways, saying, depending on how you define Jew of color and who you count in that bucket, the number changes. When they looked at Hispanic, Black, Asian, other, or multiple races, 8%. When they added in Sephardic and Mizrahi Jews into that calculation, it ended up at 14%. And then they also did one that included also immigration. So had a parent born outside of the US and Canada, that bumped it up to 17%. One thing about this data that I also was really excited about was it's one of the first times where they've asked the question about interracial and interfaith couples, which my parents were an interracial interfaith couple. When my mother was doing her doctorate, her research was on interracial interfaith couples with a Jewish woman and a Black man. And, you know, some of the census data that she had found in Canada suggested that a disproportionate number of interracial couples had a Jewish partner in them in certain sort of mixes. One of the things that was really interesting is that they actually looked at the proportion of interfaith couples who are also interracial. And the numbers were actually really interesting there, that for people who consider themselves to be Jews of no religion, who are married to somebody not Jewish, that number is about 16% of those couples. And when we look and know that that's a very high number of people who consider themselves interfaith families, that's significant.
You know, I'm curious to understand sort of, okay, well, let's put the study aside, but like, what are the really important questions that we wish a study was answering, and why would they be important? And also on the question of intermarried Jews, intermarried families, I loved one of your statistics that says, instead of the way that the Pew study publicized this data, which is where it says most Jews say being Jewish is at least somewhat important to them, you know, you pull out from that same statistic 65% of Jews married to people who are not Jewish say that being Jewish is important to them. Now, this is a really important finding from my perspective, because I grew up in a conservative Jewish community as a kid where I was told explicitly and not explicitly that by definition, Jews who intermarry don't care about Judaism, because if they cared about Judaism, they wouldn't intermarry. Simple as that. And then to have a study that shows that 65%, not only do they care about Judaism, but they say Judaism is important to them, that completely belies that story. And I would say it even belies it further. There are all kinds of other ways that we could probe in there and say, look, what a miracle that 65% of Jews who intermarry say that Judaism is important to them, despite the fact that for decades the Jewish community has said, you know, you've left us, you're bad Jews, we don't like you. You know, they still think Judaism is important. So can you imagine what would happen in a world where the Jewish community was saying, oh, that's fine?
We know that interfaith couples have progressively raise their children, the number's gone up and up and up of them raising their children Jewish. And I actually want to plot this on a timeline with the moment, for example, that the Reform movement said patrilineal descent is okay for Jewish status. The moment that the conservative movement said, we're going to invest in kiruv, in outreach to interfaith couples. The moment that the Reform movement said, okay, people who are not Jewish can belong to the synagogue too if they're in a couple. And all of these sort of policy decisions that have happened inside sort of mainstream Judaism that actually have sent the signal that, like, yeah, actually you can come in when officiation became allowed in the Reform movement, for example. And I can't prove causality, but I can definitely suggest causality here. One of the biggest jumps, and I noticed this in 2013 as well, one of the biggest jumps in interfaith couples raising their children Jewish came very shortly after the patrilineal descent resolution was passed by the Reform movement. And that says something to me. Like that's pretty huge. And I also think, Dan, what you're saying is really significant as well. And I think about this a lot. It's like our community has slammed the door in the face of interfaith couples for decades. And I think it says a lot of things. Number one, I think it says a lot about how people view Jewish identity as individual, not necessarily communal, in ways that might have been more typical previously, but also that people are seeing that, I look at, I think a lot about one of the statistics is that if you were raised by an interfaith couple, you are less likely to think that marrying someone Jewish is important. For me, like I think of this, I'm like, yeah, because I was raised Jewish by a Jewish parent and a parent who was not. So the way that I see it is it's important to me that if I ever have children, that they would be Jewish, and whoever I end up with is going to have to be fine with that. But does it matter if they're Jewish? No.
Exactly. Mm-hmm.
And so people see this as like proof that that an interfaith couple is going to have like children with a diluted Jewish identity. And I just don't see how that data bears that out.
You said a bunch of things I firmly agree to be true, but I think sometimes folks are skeptical. You talked about how Jewish communities have slammed the door on intermarriage. I want to get at what that is, because there's explicit ways. I mean, Dan mentioned, explicitly being told that marrying somebody who's not Jewish is equivalent to like discarding the Jewish people, or basically
you don't
saying
care.
Screw you. Yeah. That's explicit. I think especially today versus a couple decades ago, things have changed, and I don't think it's that people are necessarily explicitly saying to interfaith Jews like you're the worst. I do think the categories we draw continue to be deeply damaging. I want to throw out a hypothetical world. We could have a Pew study or a different study. And by the way, I'm not saying the Pew study is particularly bad, by the way. I think the Pew study reflects where American Jews are and how we are constructing categories. It would be no less logical to break down American Jews into Jews who observe Shavuot and Jews who don't observe Shavuot, and then look at all sorts of things about them. I'm saying Shavuot because that's my favorite holiday. I think a world where everybody observes Shavuot would be a great world. I am happy to have long conversations with people about why I think that. That's not a category we have, because we don't have entire institutions and communities that have constructed themselves around the presumption that it is an existential threat to the future of Judaism if people don't observe Shavuot. What we do have is decades and decades and decades of people who have constructed all of our basic presumptions and categories around interfaith marriage being a threat. And so even when we're not directly saying, you suck, to people who walk through the door who are in interfaith relationships, we have created all sorts of categories where those people are less welcome. When we're blind to what's happening because we think, we have taken steps on these issues. When we get complacent where we think, we're not literally barring people from being members of synagogues anymore if they're in an interfaith relationship. In many religious schools, we are no longer, this was a thing, we are no longer barring people in interfaith relationships from teaching children. We could go down the list. More people are officiating interfaith weddings, more rabbis. We lose the fact that we've still got a study that thinks basically a core category that we can use as almost a stand-in for apathetic or not is in an interfaith relationship or not. Are there ways in which we should continue to be weaving together the threads you were talking about with interfaith families and the threads that relate to ethnic and racial diversity as it relates to those families that are both? I love that you talk about that, but also more generally.
We have actually constructed all sorts of understandings of what counts as more and less Jewish, and what counts as more in and more out. And one of the consistent threads through all of that has been you are less Jewish and more out if you are in an interfaith couple. Keeping in mind those signals that we send by still having, for example, public conversations about how to prevent intermarriage and things like that are happening in liberal spaces. I went on Birthright in 2004 before. And the mega event at that time had all sorts of booths telling you to marry Jewish. And me and the other child of an interfaith couple on the trip left. And I mean, we couldn't leave because you can't leave without your bus. But we left the exhibition hall and sat together being like, great. So glad that we're considered to be undesirable here. One of the things that I find really fascinating to think about is two things. Number one, when we're trying to quantify how Jewish people are and how people are participating in Judaism and all of these things, that actually we can really only measure things that already exist. So, there are these ways that people do Jewish because these are the ways that the community has provided tools to do Jewish, synagogues and community centers and donating and all of these pieces. We can't actually measure the way that Judaism is changing and the ways that people do Jewish are changing. And one of the things that's really fascinating to me is we are really, really, really wedded to this idea that the Judaism that we have now is like the authentic Judaism, but it's actually very new in Jewish history. The institutions that we have, the ways that we do it, the rules, some of the rules that we sort of enforce inside the community. When I talk to Jewish professionals, invite them to think about actually like, yes, we are all invested in the missions of our organizations and are all invested in the continued existence of our organizations for all sorts of reasons. But also, what's to say that the ways in which the community is changing are existential threats? We just have a different community. What does it mean to complicate what we expect a Jewish family to look like? 72% of couples married after 2010 outside of the Orthodox community are interfaith. That's the majority. That's the vast majority. That's like almost 3/4. And so our Jewish community just is a different community than it was a decade ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. The questions that I ask and the questions that I encourage people to ask are, what do we need to do to keep moving with this? We can't fight it. And I don't think we should fight it, but the people who want to sort of say, well, how do we turn the tide here? We can't. These are people with different kinds of connection to Jewish life, perhaps, and people who we have an opportunity to provide with Jewish content, Jewish life, Jewish community that meets their needs rather than ours.
If you ask people what is the stereotypical Jewish restaurant, I think most people
Ben, are you hungry today? Do you need a snack?
Yeah, I probably am. I don't think I've had lunch, but most people would say I think most people would say a deli. And when you think about when I think about the last 1,500 years or so of Jewish history, most Jews could not afford meat. Maybe ate it on Shabbat, maybe. So the idea that the quintessential Jewish restaurant would be a restaurant that's all about meat is as wrong-headed, I think, as that the way we practice Judaism today is the way we've always been practicing it. Like when you were saying that it's the Judaism itself that we're trying to protect, we, meaning those who are worried about it, is actually not a very old version of Judaism. Now, that doesn't mean that it's bad or good to try to protect it, but it's worth knowing, and that's one of the things that I feel with these studies, data is data, and you're calling our attention that it's important to think about how you're going to present that data. I also think, and we've talked about a bit, that it's important, what are the questions that you're even collecting, and that there have been those cases like you talked about the Canadian census. But I think also here, that whole question of a Jew of no religion, I actually think it's really important to understand the lack of religiosity of the Jews. But I actually think that the Jews who check off no religion and the Jews who later say I don't attend synagogue because I'm not religious, to my mind, they are very, very similar to one another. I'm not sure which one would have been me. And at the end of the day, the number is actually, 55, 60%, not 27%. So it's actually both worse and better, depending on your perspective, than you thought. And that's because of how they're collecting the data. So for me, at the end of the day, and maybe this gets to some of your work in 18 Doors and other work, I guess that I'm curious about what you think are the really important questions that data should be collected about. Because I think that some people think, if you define everything as Jewish, then, oh, no problem. Then everybody, it's fine. Everybody can be Jewish. But like, what is Judaism really? I think that's like a fair question to ask. And so I think we want to say, no, it's not as simple as that. We actually, there is a Judaism out there that people really want, that's rich and deep and meaningful. But like, how do we get at it through these kinds of studies and or through other kinds of ways of collecting information, like maybe you do more anecdotally through your relationships with people in 18 Doors?
I think of this really, really often. When I worked in synagogues, we had a senior staff meeting every Tuesday morning. And every Tuesday morning, we started with study. And, it was always like, oh my gosh, what am I going to bring? Especially when like you're not the rabbi who was like bringing whatever text they wanted to work through to prep their sermon. And I nailed it one week. I totally nailed it. And I think about this article all the time. There was an article in the Jerusalem Post, but it asked the question, is Judaism an operating system or an app?
That was written by a friend of ours. And I think
it cited me.
Love it.
I think that's a big circle. This is great.
Awesome. And I love this, right? Because I think of actually a bunch of other ways we've asked this question in different ways. So I think of Rabbi Karyolitsky had written the book Playlist Judaism. Rabbi Karyolitsky, of course, was best known for running the Jewish Outreach Institute, which became Big Tent Judaism, which did a huge amount of outreach work to unaffiliated Jews with a special focus on interfaith families. And he sort of used the metaphor that like, once upon a time, you wanted one song, you had to buy the whole album. And that's not how we work in this society anymore, right? Like you want a song, you buy the song. So that was like a very app-based sort of way of seeing it. And then the operating system-based way of seeing it, of course, is around values and things like that. And you know what? Now I'm wondering if maybe, Lex, given the time that this article was written, whether you shared it with me, which is very possible. I think
I did, but that's okay. I don't need the like whoever it was.
It's just
I think I was
because I'm like, I don't read the Jerusalem Post. Who told me about this? But that's probably it. Anyhow, but thinking about that is really fascinating to me because I think so much of the way that we do these community studies is kind of oscillating between this idea of Judaism as an app, which I think we're using to kind of quantify how Jewish a person is. Like, do they do these Jewish things? And Judaism as an operating system, like, are you proud to be Jewish? What are the essential parts of being Jewish for you? When I think about interfaith families and the conversations that they might have about doing Jewish or whatever it might be, a lot of the core of those conversations is about sort of the operating system side, right? Like, what is the framework in which we live our life? And I think in many ways, we are asking the questions backwards in these studies, right? And we are asking the question backwards in the, I'm going to call them interventions that we try to make to encourage people to do more Jewish. We're like, well, if we just have the perfect program for somebody to come for Tashlich, then they're going to want to do more Jewish. And it's really looking at like opportunities to sort of stack Jewish on top of Jewish on top of Jewish. And if you just stack enough Jewish moments, somebody magically is going to want to plug in deeply. It was sometime between 2012 and 2016 when I worked at a Reconstructionist congregation. We did a Torah on tap, that sort of trend that everyone was doing and probably are still doing, where you would get the 20s and 30s out to a bar to do text study, right? That was like the super trendy program. And we did it. It was great. And we had a bunch of couples show up and they were all interfaith couples. We hadn't marketed it that way. It was just who showed up. We had a bunch of people in relationships with Jews who were not themselves Jewish, diving really deep into like text study. And for most of them, this might have been actually the first time they had done like Torah study in this way, but they had liberal arts backgrounds, right? These are people, they had English degrees, they had philosophy degrees, and they like loved the depth of this stuff. And when I think about so many of the ways that we think about programming for interfaith couples and families, a lot of it is sort of like an intro to how to do the app kind of stuff, not a opportunity to engage on sort of that structural level of like, what does it mean to have values? What does it mean to study text and all of those pieces? every time I do training, people are like, well, what do I have to do to like appeal to interfaith couples? And I'm like, talk to them and find out what they want, right? Like that's the biggest thing. Like build the relationship so that they will tell you what they need and want for you to meet them where they are. That is huge and important. And we all want to jump to the solution before like the process. Spend time in the process. And that was a very sort of circuitous answer, but I think it made sense.
I co-sign that it made sense. I also want to say that for somebody who earlier said you didn't have a good metaphor, stacking Jewish on Jewish and stacking Jewish on Jewish like Jenga blocks is a great metaphor. So you do have a great metaphor.
Yes.
That's awesome. I want to return or continue or whatever the verb is to a subject that did come up a little bit in passing before, but you mentioned that stat about sharing holidays with friends who aren't Jewish. I think that opens up a lot of really interesting threads. And I say that because I'm actually really interested in those threads. And going back to like my resentment with these studies, I think sometimes when I'm talking about the Pew study to folks, they think that I just like don't want to talk about it. They think I just like, I just resent that there's so much discourse about population studies. But what I resent isn't that we're talking about the Jewish population of the United States on a grand level. Like, I have a podcast where we talk about the Jewish population of the United States on a grand level all the time. What I so struggle with is we just stay in what feels like a really 101 territory, like that checkup of are we dying, are we not? And we don't get to the juicy stuff. Like when I think about interfaith families, I'm not interested in the conversation of are interfaith families good or are interfaith families bad or are interfaith families neutral. I'm really not interested in that. Like, and that's not just me. I mean, I'm in an interfaith relationship myself, and it's hard to be present in those conversations, but that's not actually the only reason why. I also think it's just I'm not that interested in any Jewish conversations that are like, is this good? Is this bad? Is this neutral? Because all of those are like, does it plant the seed for more Jews? Does this mean Judaism will still exist? What I'm interested in is, given that this is a reality, then what? And my question is, given if everybody agreed to treat intermarriage as a reality, as a value neutral reality, not as good or bad, a bunch of questions would then come up. Here's what I would ask, because I do ask this. Which holidays, Jewish holidays, for not talking about Christmas and other, there's good conversation to have there too. But like, which holidays are hardest? Which Jewish holidays for a reality where there are Jews and non-Jews in every Jewish space? Like if we started from the premise that there are always people in the space that are not Jewish, which experiences are harder for that set of people? I'd have a bunch of answers. One thing I'd start with, you know what holiday I have never tried to do, like an interfaith thing, invite my non-Jewish friends over to do a thing? I have never tried to do that for Purim. And I don't anticipate trying to do that for Purim, because turns out a story that a holiday that's built around a story that ends in the mass death of a bunch of non-Jews inflicted by Jews, not a great thing for people who aren't Jewish to experience, especially when it's inflected through this prism of intense joy. And by the way, I'm not here to say Purim. The takeaway here isn't nobody should ever observe Purim. I do observe Purim. But I think a takeaway is that a thoughtless Purim, a Purim that doesn't take into account, the last few chapters of this book are the mass death of a bunch of people who, as far as we can tell, themselves didn't actually do anything other than be not Jewish. Sure, we can talk about the people in that story who really are villains, who aren't Jews, Haman, etc. But like, what are some learnings you've come to? What are some issues people might not be thinking about that are important for us to be thinking about in that realm of interfaith families that I'm a part of and that you're a part of through your family of origin? Like, what aren't we thinking about that we should be, whether it's tied to Pew or not?
Before I answer that question, I'm going to let you all in on a little known fact about me, which is that before I became a Jewish professional, I was doing my master's in Jewish philosophy, and actually what kind of had me motivated to do this work was the second half of the Passover Seder in the traditional version, where you say the Shvochen Matcha prayer, which is a prayer, pour out your wrath on the nations who knoweth you not. It was actually inserted probably around the time of the Crusades. Like, there's a lot of good reasons why you might have wanted to open your door and like scream out in a foreign language that like you want God to take vengeance on the people trying to kill you. Like, okay, yes, it got in there for all sorts of historical reasons, but it sits there and in this very sort of messianic moment of hoping for redemption in our Seder. And like, that's really complicated. That's really complicated. And I was really interested. Like, I didn't grow up saying it, to be honest. My family Seder was like actually a Seder supplement where Moses was a union organizer. It was great. But I was really interested in like, actually, how can we preserve these really like icky parts of Jewish tradition that ended up in there because of historical realities combined with theology that actually have fruitful places to have hard conversation about what does it mean to be a persecuted minority? What does it mean to mesh theology and history and politics? But that was actually part of my path into Jewish professional life, weirdly, was this prayer about Jews praying for God to like slaughter people. But, you know, one of the things that I think I agree fully that as long as we're staying in this conversation about is interfaith marriage good for the Jews, bad for the Jews, or neutral, we're actually missing the boat. And as long as we're still evaluating people in that way, even if we conclude it's good for the Jews, there still is a degree of that sort of shaming going on. And we got to stop doing that because interfaith marriage is the end. The other things that I hear really often all tie to that. Interfaith couples feel like when they step into Jewish spaces, they have to pretend that the other part of their identity does not exist. Whether that is denying that there's a Christmas tree in the house. And this one is also very funny for me because my Jewish mother was the one who wanted to do Christmas. My dad didn't care. He like left the church. He had no interest in doing Christmas. We still do Christmas Eve and Christmas morning with my mother. My parents have been divorced for like 18 years, something like that. We do Christmas with my mom first. And, you know, she was like, what? I get to do Christmas. This is fun. Like, this is great. But, you know, thinking about some of the ways that we've told this story that these other, and some of it, I get it. It's like minority culture fears of like losing what makes us unique because the majority culture will cause everyone to assimilate or whatever it might be. And that is real. And I want to acknowledge it and name it that is a fear that people have. At the same time, like, I just think about like, what would it mean if actually instead of being like, ooh, a Christmas tree means that somehow you're betraying your Judaism because clearly Christmas is way sexier than Hanukkah is. And therefore, this is a threat, an existential threat, back to that language, to your Jewish identity to have this Christmas tree, to like creating spaces with just robust Jewish identity and connection that is not defined over and against other cultures. I think as long as we are still caught up really deeply in this identifying what is more Jewish as what is less something else, we are going to continue to push interfaith families away.
Wow. I want folks listening to just take that in. So pausing for a second. What I took you as saying is basically we've defined being Jewish, we've defined Judaism, Jewishness, largely through not doing something that is not Jewishness. Like we've said that like if you don't have a Christmas tree, that's how, and you know, you also have Jewish parentage or like you converted to Judaism. Like that's sort of how you most establish that you're really doing this thing. It's like you're resisting the pull of the thing that isn't Jewish. And when you define stuff that way, like, sure, subtracting a negative, it's a positive mathematically, but I don't think it's sustainable to define a group identity by not being a different group. So I just want folks to sit with that. I have a very different question, which is you are active on Twitter and you are, and I say that with mixed feelings about Twitter as a space. We talk about digital Judaism all the time on this podcast. We are digital Judaism as a podcast. What are some of your reflections on that ecosystem on Twitter, and ways in which, it's of course like a toxic space in so many ways. And I know you've also been, I've seen some threads and some instances where people have been terrible to you. And so that's awful. Are there ways in which you'd layer that onto this conversation or set of conversations as we close out?
Yeah, Twitter is a very strange space. I jokingly say, if I could go back in time and sever the trajectory of my Jewish professional life from my Twitter, I totally would. But here I am. I'm fully in it, and it is what it is. As far as social media spaces go, it's actually my preferred social media space because of the way the conversations flow. And also it's incredibly toxic. And one of the things that I just will say is, like, looking at it as a digital space for creating Jewish community, one of the things that has been really fascinating to me is the way that it has allowed informal community to build. The vast majority of Jews of color who I've gotten to know who are not also Jewish professionals, I've met on Twitter. It's become a place where more marginalized Jews, however you want to define that, whether it's by race, whether it's by geography, whether it's by disability, socioeconomic status, all sorts of things, have been able to find each other in a free and interactive community. And there was a trip I took to New York before the pandemic. Remember traveling? There was a trip I took to New York, and I realized at the end of the trip that pretty much everyone I had seen, other than my family, was somebody I met on Twitter. And that is totally wild. So there's huge possibility there for people who go into it sort of with a certain degree of resilience, because people are mean on Twitter. People are really mean on Twitter. And I would just encourage people, like, stick through it. Like, there's all sorts of great stuff going on, just once you can sort of wade through that noise, for people to really build the Jewish community that they want if they can't find that where they are.
Thank you so much for joining us. This has been a fantastic conversation.
Yeah, this has been fun. Thanks for having me.
And thank you so much to all of you out there for listening. We hope you've enjoyed this episode, and we hope that you'll tune in again in the future. A reminder to head to our show notes on the website, judaismunbound.com. Just head to our podcast section, and you can check out the original source of the Pew 2020 study. You can also take a look at Tema Smith's awesome article that reframes that study in certain ways, and a few other related links. So we definitely encourage you to go there always, but especially for this conversation that we just had. Also, we love it when you're in touch with us, and there are a wide variety of ways for you to do that. First, you can head to our Facebook or our Twitter or our Instagram. All of our handles are Judaism Unbound. You can email us at dan@judaismunbound.com or lex@judaismunbound.com. You can head to our website, judaismunbound.com. And the last thing that we deeply appreciate is if you are able to support us financially, which you can do on either a one-time basis or as a monthly recurring gift. So we would love, love, love if you go ahead with that. And the final note that we will close this episode on is that support for this episode of Judaism Unbound comes from the Ashman Family JCC in Palo Alto, California, whose vision is to be the architects of the Jewish future. The Ashman Family JCC empowers you to experience Jewish paths toward a life of joy, purpose, and meaning through innovative Jewish learning and wellness programs, community building, and initiatives to develop the next generation of Jewish leaders. Learn more at www.paloaltojcc.org. And with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.